Hello everyone. Okay, hopefully you have your ecology basic notes handout in front of you and a pencil. We're going to work through these slides together. Feel free to stop the recording whenever you need to catch up, because that's one of the good things about this strategy for note taking. And then make sure you bring any questions you have that weren't answered by the lecture to class, and we'll discuss them. All right, anyway, let's get started. This is our ecology basics notes. Okay, so the key concepts in ecology, sort of the overarching theme, if you will, is that ecology is the study of the interactions within and among populations. And we're going to define what a population means in a bit. But ecology is also about how nutrients move through an ecosystem, and how energy moves through an ecosystem. So we're going to be learning about those things. Those are our key concepts, if you will, for ecology. Let me get my pointer here. Very good. So much better. All right. So ecology is the study of the interactions between organisms. It's about relationships between organisms and with organisms in their environment, and it focuses or has a key component of energy transfer. Okay, what do I mean when I say environment? Well, there are two basic components that make up an environment. These are called biotic factors and abiotic factors. A biotic factor refers to anything that's a living organism, anything that is alive. That is a biotic factor. And an abiotic factor, A means not, so not biotic factor, is the non-living parts of an environment. This is going to be things like the weather, the soil, the light, the temperature, anything that's not a living organism but makes up part of the environment. Now on your notes handout, you have a little box where one is labeled biotic and one is labeled abiotic. You want to put some examples of biotic and abiotic factors into those boxes. And some examples are, for living things, these include plants and animals and bacteria, mushrooms and other fungus. Non-living things are abiotic factors. Those are things like soil and the air currents and the minerals and the sunlight and the availability of water and rainfall and such. All right, these are abiotic factors, and those are the kinds of examples that you want to populate in those two boxes on your notes handout. Okay, if we look at the whole planet, we can find or discern a variety of different organizing levels. So we can talk about the biosphere, which is the entire planet, or we can talk about an ecosystem or a community progressively getting smaller, population, individual organisms. So these are the organizing levels of ecology, and we're going to talk about each of those in turn. So let's start out with the term organism, like a zebra. An organism is any unicellular or multicellular form of life that has the characteristics of life and is an individual. So this is the most simple level of organization in the ecology world. That's an organism, an individual organism, like that zebra, or you. You are an organism. Now, if you get a whole collection of given organisms together, you can call it a population. So we want to define a population as a group of organisms of the same species that live together in the same place at the same time. They can interbreed and produce offspring. They compete for resources. These are the characteristics of a population. So let me give you an example. Of course, here's a picture of a population of zebras. I live a couple miles east of here in a community called Rancho Penasquitos, and it's next to the Black Mountain Open Space Reserve. So we have a lot of open space in my neighborhood, and that means we have coyotes. So there are a bunch of coyotes that live in the open space around my neighborhood, and those coyotes represent a population of coyotes. They live in the same area, they are the same species as each other, they compete for resources like food and mates and so on with each other, and so that represents a population of coyotes. Now, I used to live north of Los Angeles in a community called Santa Clarita, same kind of place, really, because it was surrounded by open space, and so we had coyotes there. And those coyotes represent another population of coyotes. They're not the same population, even though they're the same species, because they live in a different place and they don't interact with one another. The organisms that make up a population have to be able to interact with one another to be considered the same population. And those coyotes that live north of LA, even though they're the same species, can't interact with the ones that live here in San Diego, so they represent two different populations. All right. Now, the next term we want to define is a community. A community is a group of populations of different organisms that you find in a shared environment and depend on each other. So here we have, in this picture, we have zebras and wildebeests living together on the plains of Africa, and they are a community because there are different populations inhabiting a similar area, and they depend on one another for some kind of component of their life. So that's what a community is. Okay, an ecosystem is the next level up in our levels of organization, and an ecosystem is the populations in a community and the abiotic factors that those organisms interact with. So it's not just the giraffes and the zebras and the lions and whatever else makes up this particular, whatever else you find living in this area, but also the water and the soil and the sunlight, okay? The abiotic factors that these organisms interact with are part of its ecosystem or part of the ecosystem in an area. Okay, so you have populations and communities and the abiotic factors that they interact with. That's an ecosystem. And then the highest level of organization is the biosphere. There's only one biosphere for the whole planet. And it makes up all the life-supporting portions of the Earth. So this is the air, the water, the seawater, and the fresh water, all the organisms, the soil, all of this, all the biotic and abiotic factors that you find on the planet. They are part of the biosphere. Good? Wonderful. Okay, so another thing we want to define, another thing that we need to clarify is the difference between a habitat and a niche. And we'll talk about organisms having both of these characteristics, so we need to understand what that means. So a habitat is where something lives. Like those coyotes that I mentioned a couple minutes ago, their habitat is the open space behind my house. That's where they live. It's their address, if you will, their home. It's a place. That's a habitat. A niche is a job. What a given population or the members of a population do in the ecosystem, like their profession. Okay, and here's this cartoon that helps us maybe get to that, hopefully. So here's a garter snake, and the garter snake lives here in San Diego. You could probably find one in the to the north of the school here in the places that haven't been built up yet. So I live in most of the places you see today, says a garter snake. Now garter snakes aren't the best spellers, so this guy misspelled the word fields. The garter snakes live in forests and fields and marshes, and that makes up their habitats. The job of the garter snake is to eat things like this frog. Of course, garter snakes don't only eat frogs, they also eat fish and mice and maybe even bird eggs. So the job of this garter snake is that of a predator. It eats other organisms. The place where it lives is the fields and forests. So that's the difference between a habitat and a niche. And when we want to think about where can an organism live, what criteria does it need to have to survive, we're referring to its zone of tolerance. Okay, so the zone of tolerance for a given organism is the conditions, the abiotic conditions, where that organism can survive, not thrive, but survive. So conditions of water and temperature and atmosphere and nutrient availability, where an organism can survive. That's what the zone of tolerance is. Now, if you look at your notes handout, there's an empty box at the bottom of the page where it looks like you're supposed to draw something or write something, and that box is supposed to be left empty. I was supposed to delete it before I printed the handout, and I didn't delete it. So the box at the bottom of page 1, you can just leave empty, skip, move on. We're moving on to the next page. So here's a picture of a cute little puppy and a cute little kitty, and everyone's going, oh, so they're so cute. And that means we're going to move into the relationships part, or talk a little bit about the relationships part in ecology. So can't we all just be friends? Right? You flipped your handout over. You are looking at the back of your handout now. Let's talk about this. So these are biotic interactions. So one kind of organism interacting with another kind of organism. That's a relationship. Okay. One type of relationship that organisms engage in is called competition. That's where two or more organisms compete with each other for a limited resource. What might that resource be? What kinds of things might organisms compete for? Well, food, water, shelter, mates, right? So those are the kinds of things that organisms compete for. And just to be clear, this competition, usually we're referring to competition within a population, but sometimes it's one population competing with another population. All right, so both of those are examples of competition, either two coyotes competing over a rabbit, or coyotes and wolves competing over rabbits, right? Does that make sense? I hope. All right. So these are pictures are just to remind us that organisms compete for limited resources like food, mates, shelter, and so on. Another kind of relationship we want to talk about is the producer-consumer relationship. All right. So a producer is a kind of organism that produces something. That's why it's called a producer. And for us, all producers are plants. They are producers produce energy. They trap energy from the sun. And the term for an organism that produces its own food is autotroph. I don't know how far you've gotten on your language of science worksheet by this point, but auto means self, and troph means feeding, or trophic means feeding. So autotroph is a self-feeder. It's a plant that it's an organism that makes its own food. So that's a plant. Converts sunlight into usable biological energy. That is a producer. So producers and autotrophs, those terms are kind of interchangeable. All right? So plants. A consumer consumes things. Consumers are heterotrophs. Hetero means other. Heterotroph, other feeder. So a heterotroph eats other organisms. They ingest food containing the sun's energy. So in other words, they eat plants, or they eat other organisms that already ate plants. So herbivores are plant eaters, carnivores are meat eaters, omnivores eat anything like us, and decomposers break down dead organic matter. These are all consumers of one kind or another because they are consuming other organisms, not making their own food. Good? A third type of relationship or biotic interaction we want to consider is the predator-prey relationship. So that's where a predator hunts a prey animal for food, like this lion hunting this predator. The lion is the hunter or the predator, and the zebra is the prey. All right, so the predator-prey relationship is another one that we consider in our discussion of ecology. I think that's probably pretty straightforward. And then the last kind of relationship, or actually the next to the last kind of relationship or a biotic interaction that we want to discuss is symbiosis, which means living together. And we have different examples of symbiosis. Commensalism, mutualism, parasitism we'll talk about one by one, all right? But this is a way to look at how organisms interact with each other. So commensalism is the first one, and that's the situation where one species benefits or gets something good out of the relationship, and the other species doesn't. The other species isn't hurt, but it's not benefited, all right? And so an example of that would be polar bears and cyanobacteria. So if you've ever been down to the zoo, which I bet you have, and you've been out way up to that upper corner where the polar bears hang out, you might have noticed that they look a little bit greenish. So the situation is a polar bear's hair is hollow. A given hair piece is a hollow tube, and inside that hollow tube of hair can grow a kind of bacteria called cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria is a producer. It's a green bacteria, and it can live inside the hollow hairs of a polar bear. So this is a commensal relationship because the cyanobacteria gets a nice safe place to live away from its predators, but the polar bear doesn't really get anything out of this relationship. It doesn't benefit in any way, but it's not hurt either. So that we would describe this relationship between polar bears and cyanobacteria as a commensal relationship, because one species benefits, the other one doesn't benefit and isn't hurt. Other examples are, in particular, this leafy sea dragon here, which is in the next diagram. So if you look at this picture, it looks like a plant with big leafy projections, but in reality, there's a critter, an organism called the leafy sea dragon that lives inside, nestled inside, hidden inside this plant. Now, what do you think the sea dragon gets by living inside or making a home inside this plant? Well, probably, most likely, it's protection. The sea dragon can hide from its predators inside, by living inside this plant, because the sea dragon looks just like the plant, right? The plant doesn't get anything out of this because there's no benefit to the plant. There's nothing harming the plant. So this is a commensal relationship. The sea dragon benefits by being protected. The plant gets nothing. Good? All right, the next kind of symbiosis we want to talk about is called mutualism. And that's the situation where both species get some kind of benefit from the relationship. So we have examples of cleaning birds and cleaner shrimp. So here's a rhino, and rhino's skin, the skin of a rhinoceros is a little bit well, it's a good environment for parasites to grow. And that can be a bad thing for the rhino, to have a bunch of critters burrowing into its skin and damaging its skin. So the rhino has this symbiotic relationship with this cleaner bird that kind of hangs out on the back of the rhino and eats the bugs and parasites that would cause the rhino skin problems. So the rhino benefits because it gets its skin cleaned off and it stays healthy. The bird benefits because it gets lunch. So both species are benefiting. That is an example of mutualism. Another example is our butterfly. So what does the butterfly get from a relationship with a flower? Well, the butterfly gets food, right? It gets nectar from the flower to survive. And what does the flower get? Well, when the butterfly lands on the flower, it's the pollen from the flower will stick to the butterfly's legs, and then when the butterfly leaves and goes to another flower, it can deposit that pollen, and that means that the flowers get propagation. They get to spread their genes from one. They get pollinated from one flower to the next. So both species are benefiting. That means it is mutualism. Good? Good. All right, the third type of symbiosis we want to talk about is called parasitism. And that's where one organism benefits and the other one is damaged somehow. So these are this is maybe the easiest sort of symbiosis to think about. These are things like ticks and fleas and tapeworms and things, the parasites that live inside or on other organisms, and the second organism gets nothing from the relationship and in fact is hurt by the relationship, and the leech or the tick or the flea benefits. Parasites. The last kind of biotic interaction we want to mention is group behavior, and this is one that we don't understand as well as some of the other things, but it's true that organisms will, in a given population, will use group behaviors, strategies that benefit the whole group, but not necessarily the individual. So, for example, these are things like flocking and schooling and herding, right? So if we look at the school of fish here, an individual fish is at high risk of getting eaten by this predator here because he's alone and easily seen. But if a whole school of fish is together, most of the fish are going to survive the predation by this predator here. So by combining themselves, by grouping together into this large school of fish, most of the fish are protected, and that's good for the group. So it increases the survival of the whole group. That doesn't mean that everyone is safe, though. Some of these fish will still get eaten, some of the ones on the outside of the school. So this particular kind of behavior, schooling or herding or flocking, they benefit the group, but they may not necessarily benefit the individual. And so that's why we call this group behavior. It increases the survival likelihood of the whole group. Okay, we need to talk about energy. So remember, it's at the beginning, ecology is about relationships between organisms and also about energy flow and energy cycling. So we need to do some definitions and a little understanding about energy. We'll start with the idea of a trophic level. Trophic means feeding. We mentioned that a little while ago. Here it is again. So each link in a food chain or each level in a in an energy pyramid represents a trophic level. And these levels represent feeding steps in the transfer of energy. This is basically a study of who eats whom, right? And we will talk about this again in a second, but the energy transfer from one level to the next, so from plants to the herbivore, like this rat, is about 10%. We'll come back to that in just a second, but I'm kind of throwing that out there now so you can look forward to it. Okay, so trophic levels. We have some new nuances to the terminology that we've used already. So we've talked about producers and consumers, right? Producer is someone who produces something like a plant, an autotrophic plant. That's a producer. Now, we actually are going to call them primary producers because they, although there aren't secondary producers, there are only primary producers, so it's a little bit of an unnecessary term. But a primary producer is an autotrophic plant that makes its own energy, captures its own, captures sunlight to make its own energy, like plants. And then the other category was a consumer, but we have a bunch of different types of consumers. So there's a primary consumer, and a primary consumer is one that eats plants. All right, it's an herbivore. So a primary consumer is the first consumer, and it eats the producers. A secondary consumer is an organism that eats other organisms, that eats the herbivores. So we would call these guys carnivores. Carnivores eat herbivores. They don't eat the plants directly, they eat the organism that ate the plants. So that's a secondary consumer. And you have higher level consumers, tertiary consumers and quaternary consumers that eat successively higher levels of other organisms. And then we have the decomposers, another kind of consumer that consume dead organic matter. So we're talking about bacteria or certain kinds of worms or fungi, mushrooms, and the like. Okay, those are decomposers that break down dead things. They are also consumers. Okay, so we have some additional layers to our producer-consumer relationship. Here's an example, a couple examples of trophic levels. All right, so we have our primary producers, and that's a plant of some kind, either a land plant or a water plant, like a phytoplankton. That's a tiny organism that captures sunlight and turns it into usable biological energy. The primary producer is consumed or chomped by the primary, nope, I said that wrong. The primary producer is eaten by the primary consumer. That would be an herbivore like the cricket, or the zooplankton, which is another really small organism that lives in the ocean and eats plants. The secondary consumer eats the primary consumer, so this mouse, rat, I don't know, critter, eats the cricket. So that makes this guy a secondary consumer, like this fish that eats zooplankton. That makes it a secondary consumer. And then you have a tertiary consumer that eats the secondary, and so on. All right, so you get up to a quaternary consumer like this hawk or the orca whale, that eats at the third level consumers. All right. So these are examples of food chains. And that's back to your notes now. That will be, you'll see that under the energy flow part of your notes. Time to go to class. So a food chain is a linear diagram or example of the energy pathway in an ecosystem. So you've got one organism that eats another organism that eats another organism that eats another organism that eats a plant. All right, it's a straight line. It's a chain. That's why we call it a food chain. But most organisms don't just have one food source. So in reality, this snake probably doesn't just eat this one particular rat or rodent. It probably has several different food sources. And so a better way to represent energy flow in an ecosystem is a food web. This shows all the different possible relationships through whom eats whom, who eats whom. So for example, here is our snake, who we were just talking about. The arrow points from the organism that gets consumed to the consumer. So this snake eats toads, and this snake eats predaceous insects, and this snake eats herbivorous insects, and this snake eats birds, and this snake eats mice, and this snake eats, what's the other thing that it points to there? Birds. All right. So the food web gives you a much broader example or image of the different relationships that are possible in an ecosystem. All right, then it's better than a food chain, which is linear and makes it look like one organism only eats one other organism. That's just usually not the case. So this is an example of a terrestrial food web. This is an example of a marine food web where we've got, the whole same kind of idea, but it's happening in the water rather than on the land. So that's what a food web is. And then we have these diagrams called ecological pyramids, and you can use them in different ways. You can use them to represent energy in an ecosystem, or you can use them to represent the numbers of organisms in an ecosystem, or the actual mass of organisms. Sorry, here are numbers. Here's mass of organisms in an ecosystem, and these diagrams are probably a little hard to see. We're going to focus on this energy pyramid over here. So we have our producers at the bottom. We call it a pyramid, of course, because it starts wide at the bottom and it gets smaller as you go up, like a pyramid. Okay, so at the bottom level of our pyramid are the producers, and they are plants, and they are autotrophs. They produce their own energy. And for the sake of this example, we're going to say our producers create 10,000 units of energy. We measure that in kilocalories, kcal, but that's not super critical. Just from an example perspective, we have producers that make 10,000 units of energy. Most of those units of energy will be used by these plants to do plant things, like make seeds and make roots and grow and make fruit, whatever it is a plant does. 90% roughly of the energy that these producers create, they use for themselves. But when that plant gets eaten, about 10% of this energy is available to the consumer, to the organism that eats the plant. In this case, it's a cricket. When this cricket eats these plants, it gets about 10% of the energy that those producers captured from the sun. So that's why for the cricket, the primary consumer, we have a 1,000 here. That's 10% of 10,000. Yeah. And then most of the energy that this cricket consumed, most of this 1,000 units, gets used to do cricket things like jump around and make those annoying sounds in the middle of the night. But when the cricket gets eaten by a bird, about 10% of what the cricket ate is available to the bird. All right, so the bird gets 100 energy units by consuming the cricket. All right, so another 10% reduction, 10% availability. All right, and then the bird uses the energy to do bird things like make eggs and fly around. But when that bird gets eaten by the owl or the hawk or whatever, about 10% of that energy that the bird consumed is available to the owl. So we refer to this as the 10% rule. All right, so about 10% of the energy from one level is available to the next higher level. And you can see that with these numbers. And that's pretty generally true whether you're looking at an energy pyramid or a biomass pyramid where you're actually calculating the mass of organisms at a given level, or a numbers pyramid where you're looking at the numbers of organisms, roughly about 10%. So the amount of energy available gets smaller and smaller as you move up the pyramid, and so it takes more and more organisms at a higher let me rephrase that. For a given level, it takes a number of organisms at the lower level to support it. This owl can't eat just one bird and be satisfied. That 10 kilocalories, that 10 units of energy that it gets is not enough to support it. So it's going to need to eat a bunch of birds. Each one of these birds can't eat just one cricket and survive. It's going to have to eat a whole bunch of crickets. All right. So the higher you go on an energy pyramid, the fewer organisms can be supported by the lower levels. All right. And so that means that, in other words, I'm saying energy availability decreases as you move up a food chain or a food pyramid. All right. But the last thing we want to talk about are toxins in the food chain. And so a toxin is a poison of some kind. Toxins increase as you move up a food chain or up a food pyramid, the opposite of energy. So let me work through this example with you really quickly. So there's this pesticide, something that kills bugs. It was called DDT, and I don't remember what DDT stands for. It's a really long chemical name. But it was like in the 50s and 60s, we used DDT a lot to kill bugs. And you didn't have to use a whole lot of it. It was pretty powerful. You could spray it on your crops or spray it in the water near your crops. It would kill off the pests. So in this diagram here, we have a little bit of DDT in the water. It's enough to kill the pests, but it's not really enough in the water to hurt anything else. However, the plants that live in this water, the producers, gather some of that toxin. They concentrate it inside their bodies as they grow. And so, whereas there's only a little bit of toxin in the water, within a given plant that lives in that water, the amount of toxin gets concentrated or magnified. We call this biological magnification. All right. So the producers are exposed to more toxin than you just see in the water because they concentrate it in their bodies. And then, of course, the zooplankton that eat those producers get an even larger dose because one zooplankton has to eat a whole bunch of producers, right? And so the amount of exposure for the zooplankton is a lot higher than it is for a given producer. Then the small fish will eat the zooplankton, and one small fish is going to eat a whole bunch of zooplankton, so it's going to eat a whole bunch of this toxin, and so the amount of toxin in a given small fish is a lot higher than it was in a given zooplankton. And you see this proceeds. So a large fish eats smaller fish, again gets an even bigger dose of the toxin, and so on. By the time you get to the birds that eat the big fish, they get a really, really large dose of this toxin. Now, the amount of toxin that was put in the water is not enough to hurt a bird. But the amount of toxin that appears in these big fish after this biological magnification process is enough to kill off the bird. And this happened in the 60s. We noticed that the bald eagle populations were crashing because the bald eagles eat this fish. This fish has eaten smaller fish and so on. The toxins have concentrated or magnified as you moved up the food chain, and so the bald eagles were being killed by DDT because it was a huge dose of DDT, far more than anyone saw in the water. And so we realized that, this biological magnification process was killing off the bald eagles. Okay, so that's an example of biological magnification. That's the last slide for today. Make sure you bring your questions and your clarifications tomorrow so we can make sure everyone understands everything, and we'll be moving on from there. All right, bye.